Welcome to Suncoast In-Depth Podcast. I'm here with Ricardo Aviles again, and that's always a joy, man.
I love doing these things, man. I'm excited you're starting a new series.
Yeah. So that new series is, I'm calling it Reconstruction Junction because I am a reconstruction aficionado.
Yeah, that's what you were just telling me.
Yeah. So what I want to do in this series, because I see so many people personally in my own personal relationships and online, you see all kinds of deconstructed folks just slamming their previous faiths.
Right.
And as I put it, I see too much of people who are left in limbo, where they've done it in a way that throws the proverbial baby Jesus out with the bathwater. And I don't think that that's necessary or even healthy. Mm-hmm. And so I'd like to help people any way I can to rebuild something that's more sustainable as a faith, mm-hmm. and isn't filled with all kinds of easy straw men to bowl over, you know. And I think a lot of that is due to the reason that people end up in that place is they only know the version of their Christian faith that they grew up with, and almost without exception. In fact, I can't even think of an example where that a person was deconstructing and they were not from a background like either very traditional Roman Catholicism, mm-hmm. or most often some version of evangelical charismatic persuasion. So fill us in a little bit on your religious background.
So I grew up in the church my whole life. From the day I was born, I was going to church. And kind of along the similar story a lot of people have, going to church on Wednesday nights, Sunday morning, Sunday night. I grew up in Assemblies of God, which, if you don't know that, that's a very charismatic Pentecostal mm-hmm. Style of Christianity. And so it was one of those situations, like, even though I grew up in it, I knew it was a little strange to people outside of the church. Mm-hmm. So there was like this, almost hidden shame. I never really invited my friends to church very much, unless they told me oh yeah, I go to this charismatic church. I'm like, oh, you should try mine, come. Yeah. So if I knew they were in a similar camp, I invited them. Do you
feel like I'm just curious, do you feel like your friends in the church also felt that way?
I never, it was one of those things that you never said out loud.
How about your parents? Because obviously you were closer with them.
Again, my parents, as sad as the sound, didn't have a huge network of friends. They had people that they worked with. My mom is much more relational than my dad. But no, I never saw them really invite friends. And I never really had a conversation. Like I said, it was kind of like I knew it, but I never really said anything. It was one of those situations where church lasted 2.5 hours.
Oh yeah.
And it was pretty traditional. It wasn't a very contemporary church.
Okay, so what do you mean by traditional? Because what traditional means to people from various backgrounds mm-hmm. is very different one to the other, right?
Sure. It wasn't traditional in the sense of Catholicism, right? We had music and we had a band, and there weren't creeds that we said or anything like that. But they're traditional in the sense, if you compare it to a place like Suncoast, it was pretty traditional. We played a lot of hymns, but we also played, more current stuff as well. But it was one of those things the pastor would be talking and somebody would just stand up in the middle of his sermon and start speaking in tongues. Mm. And then somebody else would have to translate, the message. Mm-hmm. A lot of speaking in tongues, a lot of flag waving. And if you didn't grow up in that, it feels very strange. And I had an awareness of that. I knew it was. And One of the things.
Were you pressured, just back on the tongues thing? Did you feel pressured that you should be speaking in tongues?
Yeah, very much so.
Do you?
No.
Okay.
No. It was one of those things that, again, it was something it was surrounded within that faith that I like to think I was relatively logical from day one. I am an emotional person, but I try to not wrap up in my emotions. Mm-hmm. So there was this logical side to me that it was just like, this doesn't make sense. And there was a lot of pressure, especially as I became older. I went on staff when I was 16 at this church.
Oh,
started
I didn't know that.
Heading the youth music program, and then eventually the main auditorium. They hired me to be the worship pastor when I was around 17, 18, once I graduated high school. And there was a lot of pressure to be blessed with the gifts of the Spirit. And, the gifts of the Spirit include like speaking in tongues, prophecy. Thank you. I was looking for that word. Things like that, like during worship, it's like those old Benny Hinn videos, Benny Hinn would just lay his hands on people and they'd fall.
I had his youth pastor come and speak at the Lutheran church where I worked. And, just to the kids. And there were visiting youth there. There were probably around 200 kids there, and my adult volunteers, and some of the adults from the church council came and just wanted to see, because he was a semi-famous guy.
Right.
And when they saw all these kids laid out, I got a call from Pastor Carmichael saying, well, Brett, I think we're going to have to get together with the council. They're a little concerned about your event. So,
yikes.
But
but that's what I'm talking about. That's the reaction that I was afraid of.
Yeah.
People would just be scared off, think I'm weird. And, I remember this tumultuous relationship with God in that time, because I was like, why am I not receiving these gifts? I feel like to get to that next level of my Christian faith, I needed to receive those gifts, and that's how it was presented to me. It's like the closer you are to God, the closer you get to receiving these gifts. And
right.
And I just I remember faking it kind of thing.
Can you still fake it?
No, it's been so long. I've been at Suncoast for 14 years, so that's one of those things. But there was a lot
of that Troy does. He does. No, we shouldn't make fun.
Yeah, but there was this contention between God and I, in the sense that I felt like I was doing everything right, and
I bought a Honda.
I should have bought a Honda. Yeah,
that's what it is.
And but I don't know. It just never really came, and I knew a lot of kids, especially at my age, I don't know, like I would just question, like, are you really feeling this? Are you really, like, when somebody lays hands on you, do you really feel the need to fall? Or
did you ever feel like that when they laid hands on you?
Yeah, I felt like this pressure, especially from like any sort of, because we used to have evangelists come in all the time to our church, and along the same vein, very charismatic. And they'd lay hands on me, and you could feel this pressure of like, almost like they were trying to push me over, but I'm just like resisting it the whole time. Like it just never, I was waiting for this miraculous feeling to come over me, and to where I would just lose my legs, and I would just fall on the ground, and I'd be in this liminal. I
can imagine you probably wanted it, right?
Yeah, no, it wasn't that I was like, I don't want this.
Yeah.
Get your hands off me. I wanted it desperately, but I wanted the feeling to be authentic.
Yeah.
I kept waiting for this moment of just like, okay, I'm going to fall out, and I'll be in this liminal space, and I'll have this amazing, almost conversation with God within this moment. And it never happened.
So when you're leading a community the community, our community, in a worship song.
Mm-hmm.
I watch you guys, right? And I feel like you're very sincerely kind of immersed in a sense of God's presence. Like your awareness is peaking at times.
Yeah.
Is that true?
Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it would be that kind of feeling that you'd be looking for, right? If somebody's praying on you,
Yeah.
And I have to say that I also had a lot of experience with that kind of background. It was really more with the Vineyard movement,
Yeah. I remember Vineyard.
but very similar.
Yeah.
Except the music was, very contemporary for then.
Right.
And I did have times where I felt like I lost my legs.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like you, I wanted it to be an authentic experience with God. I didn't want it to be something I felt pressured to do.
Or even just like the showmanship of it.
Right.
You start to question like, are you really doing this? Or are you just,
Yeah.
Trying to prove to people,
100%.
it's like the guy that walks around with his Bible 24/7. It's like, you're not reading it 24/7. Are you just trying to prove to people that you're a super Christian? Like,
Right.
It's kind of like that.
Yeah, it is. And I had those thoughts too. But just full disclosure, I did have times where I felt like, yeah, man, I didn't go up there intending to fall over.
Mm-hmm.
And they were good. The people that I was associated with, they really didn't pressure people.
Mm-hmm.
There were people that fell, there were people that didn't.
Yeah.
And all of that was seen as fine.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't feel that same kind of pressure, but
Yeah.
anyway.
And just to be clear too, like, I may not be speaking very highly of my church upbringing, but a lot of the memories that I have are very good.
Sure.
That was a really special time in my life. Were there traumatic things and bad things that happen within that story? Yes, but I don't focus on those. I focus on the people that I were in my community and the pastors that took me under their wing and all of the relationships that I had and still have to this day with some of those people.
Yeah.
I very much am thankful for my upbringing in the church. It really, even though some of the people were weird and strange, they were good people, and they were just doing the best that they could with what they had.
Yeah.
And so I'm very thankful for that upbringing.
Yeah.
So I don't view my church experience
With disdain or anything.
No, not at all. I'm very thankful for it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I appreciate that about you. And I think that's an important part of the process. I realize that for many, that's more difficult because they might have had abuse,
Sure.
Emotional, whatever.
Right.
They may have religious trauma out of their experience. And those people would definitely have a tougher time, holding that perspective, right?
Yeah.
But and that's my perspective on my past. Runs with fundamentalist Christianity, charismatic Christianity. One of the things that I appreciated about the charismatic movement was actually the openness. As weird as that might sound to some people, they definitely were more open to experiencing God than other evangelical friends and pastors that I had, and many I still have.
That's interesting because I have two experiences within the church, my upbringing in Suncoast, Community Life Center in Port Charlotte, Florida, and Suncoast Community Church. I went to a couple other churches just trying them out, but it was never that I got involved.
I think you might have come to the youth group at Edgewater.
I did a couple times. Yeah, a couple times because all of my friends.
Was I the youth pastor then?
I don't remember, and it may have been. I was in high school when I went. I went to a couple of shows that you guys put on. Like you guys had metal shows, which was to me was like astonishing. I was just like, how's this church putting on yes, they're Christian bands, but they're hardcore metal bands, So I did, but as far as like being involved, building a community within a church, those are my two experiences.
Yeah, very different.
Very different.
Wow. So when do you think your deconstruction? Well, let's use an analogy that Pastor Larry uses. I think it's very good. where he likens faith, your belief system, if you will, to a brick wall, right?
Mm-hmm.
And each of the bricks may be a different dogma, doctrine, or something that you build this wall with, or a belief that you build into the wall. And then as you deconstruct, you start taking those bricks out, right?
Mm-hmm.
Was there a particular brick that bothered you more than others as you began to see it slipping out of place? When do you feel like your deconstruction started?
Yeah, I remember. So I was working at the church down in Port Charlotte, but Rob Bell. I started to listen to Rob Bell quite a bit. I loved his Pneuma series.
Yeah.
And he had just come out with a book. I'm going to blank on the name, but it was about
Velvet
hell.
Elvis. Oh,
I read Velvet Elvis. I loved that one, but that wasn't until later. My first book that I read was the one about hell. I can't remember the title of
I
it.
don't either. I didn't read it, actually.
Oh, Love Wins. There it is.
Oh, Love Wins.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I read that.
Yeah.
Yeah. 2011, I think.
Was it 2011? Then maybe it was a different book. I do remember.
Pretty sure.
Maybe Kyle can Google that while we're talking. But
Earn his pay a little.
yeah. So I remember reading one of Rob Bell's book, and that was like the first time I had heard. I'm trying to say this in a way that doesn't.
Trigger.
No, not trigger, but just like sound like I'm talking down to the people in my church and in my upbringing. But the only word I can come up with is like logical. You know, being raised in the charismatic faith, like there was a lot of illogical things, and you can spend hours talking about, well, what is logical? For most people, it seemed very illogical. Like, how can you tell the future, and what is this whole speaking in tongues thing, and all this kind of stuff. What year? Oh, could you look up when Love Wins came out by Rob Bell? And so that was like the first time that it was like almost like, oh, that really makes a lot of sense. 2011, man, you nailed it. So then it must have been another book. Maybe it was Velvet Elvis.
Might have been. Yeah,
and
that was before.
Between those and the Pneuma series, like really started to kind of click with me.
Mm-hmm.
But didn't really spend much time with it. But I would say that's like Rob Bell was like my introduction into progressive Christianity. But never talked to the pastors about it or anything like that.
Did you feel like you could?
No.
What did you feel like would be the response if you?
I was
said, "Hey,
afraid I
Pastor,
would lose.
I just read Velvet Elvis.
I was afraid I'd lose my job.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Or at least be taken off stage or something like that. And so I had more of these interests in kind of in private.
Mm-hmm.
I would talk to some of my friends about it, but pretty low risk conversations. So that was my introduction to deconstruction. And then once I left my church and finally landed at Suncoast, some of the more charismatic aspects I started to shed, like the pressure of the gifts of the Spirit, just letting that go.
But those weren't bricks. Would you say those weren't bricks that made the wall just fall apart?
No, not at all.
Okay.
No, it wasn't until the document that that conversation was starting to be had, and I was in a lot of those meetings with the pastors, and I remember thinking like a lot of the content that we were talking about, it was the first time I had ever heard it, in the sense that it was so clearly laid out in these different like bricks, as you're calling them, like bricks of my faith. But ironically enough, it wasn't anything that like scared me. It was just like, I never heard this before. I need to like start doing some digging soon, doing some reading. Like,
You did, right?
Yeah, I did. I dove headfirst into it. And
Was there any particular thing that you did that helped you through that process that you would feel safe about recommending to others? I know some of what you read.
Yeah,
So.
I would say I don't know. What worked for me may not work for somebody else. It may completely turn them off.
Yeah.
I would definitely recommend going at your own pace. I kind of sledgehammered the wall all at once.
Yeah, you
which
did.
I don't recommend. I would.
Why don't you recommend that?
It was very overwhelming.
And that left you feeling what? Like
I felt like, honestly, I felt like a kid that just found out Santa wasn't real. It was like this whole like paradigm of my reality just
Did you ever reach
collapsed.
a place where you were like, I don't know if God's real?
Oh yeah, for sure. And I was in a very unique situation to where I had you and I had Kevin and Larry and guys that had gone through it and come out the other side. You know, like it's like you guys were just further along the path than I was. So I knew there was a way to
Rebuild something.
rebuild these things, you know, continue to stay within this paradigm, but shedding the unnecessary things. And some bricks were easier to pull than others. Like, I always hated the concept of hell. I was so glad.
What kind of person would you be if you liked it?
I'm not going to comment on that, but like there are some people that need that for whatever reason.
That's different than liking it.
Mm-hmm.
But I do know some people that seem to not only need it, but even
Right.
they kind of like relish in it or something. I don't know.
Yeah. A lot of people like a retributive form of justice, and they feel like if you, and we don't know what's going on in their heart, we don't know what's happened in their past.
That's
but,
right.
You know, so there's
No judgment there. But
some people just find a lot of solace in the idea of the people that have done something bad to them are going to burn forever.
yeah,
You know, and I won't. But I always hated that concept. And once I found out that it was like, oh, there's another way to look at this, and this isn't exactly very biblical from the writer's standpoint and the cultural standpoint. So learning a lot of that was really, I think, more healing for my faith than anything else. And just the atonement theories, that blew my mind. I was just like, what do you mean there's other theories of what happened on the cross? You know, like it was just, that was, so I really, really started getting into, one of the first things I started doing was watching atheist and theist debates. I think, and I still hold this to be true, whenever there's a topic of discussion is finding the steel man argument for whatever you oppose. So if
which doesn't happen very often in those debates, which is why I don't usually recommend those.
Well, so for me at that point, it was, maybe if I looked back at them now, it wouldn't be. But when the way that the debates that I would watch were structured was that it wasn't just two guys arguing back and forth. Each person was given an allotted amount of time to give their thesis. So there was no interruptions. So each person holding the view was able to steelman their argument to the best of their ability. So, and then there was responses. So it was always like that first part that I really liked. Because then once they start debating or responding to the different points, they were going straw man.
Yeah.
But it at least allowed the presenter to steelman their argument the best they could with the information that they had. So I really started getting into that. I started reading textbooks from some of the authors that Larry recommended that he read in school. And then that opened the door to other authors that were writing theological work. Bart Ehrman. Him being one of the main ones that I read a lot of his work, and he's an atheist, from what I understand.
Agnostic, I think.
Maybe agnostic.
Yeah.
But he was able to draw the parallels for me that just the understanding of how the Bible was compiled and some of the motivations that we believe the authors had to do certain things and write
Yes.
certain stories a certain way.
He's extremely valuable that way.
I think
The guy is the most well-read New Testament theologian I've ever read.
Yeah.
This might sound braggadocious, but if I read a guy and I go, holy crap, I didn't know that, I feel like, wow.
Well, you've dedicated a lot of years.
My entire adult life, I've been looking at this stuff, and I've been looking across the spectrum of Christian thinkers, you know, and he does that in his books, to me anyway.
Yeah, he had a book called Jesus Interrupted.
Mm-hmm.
And I probably found that book at the very right time in my journey. I would not read that book too early.
No.
Because unless you have some sort of reconciliation with your faith or this idea of Jesus, I would not recommend that book.
And you're just looking to understand the New Testament better.
I think in that time I was trying to understand what the Bible was. Because up until that point, the Bible was very much this divine thing. Like, I had never even explored the idea of, like, well, where did the Bible come from?
Yeah.
In my mind, it was just like the Bible just was.
Yeah.
Just was. Like, so I really just didn't. This place, like, allowed me to just better understand my faith. But the first, like, to go back to the original point, the first few bricks were really easy concepts for me to pull. Loved the idea of pulling hell. I just hated that concept since I was a kid. Yeah. It was really easy for me to understand, like, okay, penal substitutionary atonement theory is pretty just illogical, and it makes God seem like a terrible, terrible deity.
Mm-hmm.
So that one was easy. That one I was like, okay, well then we can figure out other ways. And if you don't have the concept of hell, then you don't need Jesus to die for anything to save you from that. And part of the Reconstruction was learning, what was the point of the cross, and we can speculate all day, but it didn't have this, like, eternal bearing or eternal consequence if we got it wrong anymore. Then the Bible was next. And that one was one of the more difficult ones. And I think that's where the nihilism, kind of seeped in.
With the Bible.
Yeah.
Your change in how you viewed the Bible led to the nihilism. Yeah. Huh, that's interesting to me.
Yeah, because you get to start at the same time as when I was reading or listening to a lot of the atheist and theist debates. So, like, your famous ones like Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins,
Sam
Harris. They make really compelling arguments, So it was difficult. It was like at the same time I was reading Bart Ehrman while listening to these theist-deist debates.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not even, like, the deists are not even arguing for Christianity. They're just arguing for the existence of a God or a super intelligence or whatever it may be. A creator.
Set the system in place and let it go.
Correct.
Yeah.
So they weren't even religious in their ideology. I believe most of them leaned towards Christianity, but they never really. That was always the straw man argument from the atheists, was like coming after the Christian faith. But they're like, whoa, this is not what we're talking about. We're talking about whether there is a God or not. And neither of us can empirically prove that. But there was just some really compelling arguments that really kind of wrecked my view. And then you take this foundation of my faith, which was the Bible, that I utilized for everything, and you start poking not just one or two holes in it, but hundreds of holes in it. And that was where it was just one of those situations where like, this is all bullshit. You know, just the baby with the bathwater. And I really, again, I will say that.
And at that time, you were working here.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's tough.
Yeah. Well, and it was like this pressure of just, there was a lot of trauma that happened with the document. A lot of friends and people, even just that I looked up to, that just, I felt like spit in my father-in-law's face, spit in my face, just left, just treated me like I was shit.
Yeah.
I was like, you wouldn't do this to somebody else. Like, why do you feel like you're allowed or required almost to treat people this way? And that was, so it was like the perfect storm of like, screw you guys.
Yeah.
Like, screw you. I don't want anything to do with this. But I was so thankful for you and for Kevin and for Larry in that time. I know a lot of people don't have that support system, that you were able to like come beside me and just be like, and answer my questions. And I would sit in your office for hours and just like ask you all these questions about what I was reading. I know most people don't have that luxury.
Yeah.
So,
that's why I want to do things like this.
Yeah. But coming out on the other side, I feel way better. And just being able to reconcile my view of the Bible, reconcile my view of God, and really just fall in love with Jesus again. Like that, as cliche and corny as that sounds, like it.
Do you feel like your love is the same level of love for God, for Jesus, as it was before your deconstruction? Or do you feel like it's just different?
I would say it's a
greater,
more mature.
More mature.
So the only way I can relate it is...
but not less than.
No, I would say it's a greater love and appreciation. It's kind of like... the only way I could relate it is like, okay, you love your parents when you're a kid. You love them. They're the center of your world. Mm-hmm. And then you go through a period of time, a lot of teenagers do, to where you're like, ugh, my parents don't know shit. You know, they don't know anything.
Yeah.
And then as you become an adult and you become a parent, you're like, oh, wow. Okay. I get it now. Yeah. I see my parents in a different view.
Yeah, it's a great analogy.
So it's a more mature view of Jesus and a more mature view of God, in my opinion, just where it's like it's a different level of appreciation. And it's just like the message that Jesus laid out means so much more to me now than it did back then. Because to me, like, Jesus's life was completely utility. It was just come and die. Thank you for your sacrifice. As opposed to like really paying attention to his message.
And letting it transform you from the inside out. Correct.
The ideal that he laid out. And that's where, I can't remember, I think it was one of the Suncoast talks that you or Kevin were like, I have no problem saying Jesus died on the cross for my sins. But not in a transactional way, but that his message was so important that he was able to take his message all the way to the cross and was willing to die for it. And that was like a different eye-opening view of that. It's like, we can speculate all day if Jesus needed to die on that cross for his message to live on. And you can argue both ways of it, but whatever he did worked. It just did.
It did.
It transformed the world.
Mm-hmm.
There's very few parts of the world that you can go to and people don't know who Jesus is.
Yeah.
You know,
and admire him.
Yeah, because I think
even a lot of the atheists that I've listened to.
Sam Harris.
Yeah.
He admires Jesus'
What's not to
message.
respect, right?
Because there's there's an inherent good in his message that whether you're a Christian or not, it's really hard to argue with the idea of loving your neighbor.
Yeah, right.
Or turning the other cheek, or helping people when they need it, with no promise of anything in return.
Yeah.
He was a pacifist. He loved people in every sense of the word, and he loved the unlovable. Mm-hmm. He went against the religious zealots, which, if you're an atheist, that's what you're doing. You're going against the religious zealots that continue to ostracize and keep people out and tell people they're less than because they don't agree with their ideology.
Yeah. And it's wild to me. I think it's important to see this. It is for me anyway, that the atheist, even the most zealous of atheists, I really can't think of one that doesn't appreciate and even follow the gospel in terms of how they live their lives.
They wouldn't admit it, but Sam Harris is definitely along that line.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because they're profound principles that we should all be striving for.
And I guess we can kind of close with this. I see the reconstruction process as not the rebuilding of a wall,
mm-hmm.
because walls are designed to keep in and to keep out, right?
Yeah.
There may be a low wall,
mm-hmm.
But it's a low wall for a garden where people can get together for tea and talk, right? Yeah. It's meant to be inviting. It's inclusionary. Mm-hmm. It's organic,
mm-hmm.
Everybody says organic, but it's a good word.
Mm-hmm.
Something that grows out of not just what you're told, but out of an actual relationship and the experiences in that relationship
mm-hmm.
with God, with Christ, and enriches your relationships with others.
Yeah.
That is a sustainable faith that is based on principles, not on dogma.
Mm.
I think there's an important difference there.
Yeah. What would be your difference between those two?
Yeah. Well, if you hold to the principle, let's say, of I'm going to be someone who seeks after the truth. Every Christian would say they're that kind of person, right? But you can easily demonstrate with many, many, many people, Christian or not, that that's not really true. They tend to go with confirming their biases. That's 100%. A human trait. I'm not judging or anything, but if you really stick to a principle like I really am going to pursue the truth as best I can. There are a lot of variables involved there. Your life doesn't allow you to sit with a guy for 2 hours in his office and talk about these things, but there's so much information available, right?
Yeah.
And to not pretend that your beliefs, if they're to be in pursuit of truth, require evidence. That would be a principle that you live by.
Mm. That's a really good distinction.
You don't accept mutual contradictions in your beliefs, you know?
Right.
Things like that. So that would be a principle
mm-hmm.
for how you observe the world, right? Reality. Rather than, this is what you must believe. I must believe this, even at the expense of evidence, or else.
Yeah.
That would be dogmatic.
Right. Yeah. I that's a really good way to look at it. I think even in my own life, outside of theology, I always lean, whether it's nutrition or politics or any sort of like science-based room or school of thought, I always gravitate towards the guys that don't use absolutes.
Yeah.
They use as far as we know.
Yeah.
Or as to the best of our knowledge, this is what we know now. As opposed to, this is absolute fact. This is absolute truth. And it's like, even if it is, I don't appreciate that type of language. And that could be because of my Christian background. I don't know. But it definitely turns me off when anybody speaks that emphatically, that they are the arbiter of the truth.
Well, I like to think it turns me off too.
Yeah.
And it may be related to my background, my religious background, but
Yeah.
I like to think that it's more related to just being intellectually honest.
Mm-hmm.
There's very, very little that we can be absolutely certain of.
Yeah. Well, and especially when
Like math, yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
We define the parameters for it. So 2 + 2, yeah, it's 4.
Right.
You know, but very little outside of things like
when
that.
you can actually look at the world and say like, okay, there's very little that we can empirically prove.
Mm-hmm.
I had the luxury of, I just, when I get into a subject, I'm diving headfirst into it, and I will dedicate every ounce of free time to learning more and more about it. And so I did have that to where I just dove in for months. I read and watched as many videos as I possibly could consume.
Yeah, that's me too.
And so it was just one of those things. Like I think my deconstruction, reconstruction was a little quicker than most. It wasn't years, it was months.
Yeah, yours was pretty blazing.
Right. And but it continues, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like as
Sure.
we continue to wrestle with different ideas, that's why.
That's the other thing, that principle-based living.
Right.
That's one of the other things that it achieves for you.
Right.
It leaves things open. You're simply going after the truth.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's the biggest one with even just my current friends that are still pretty fundamental Christian. We always start talking and exploring these different ideas. They're like, well, the Bible says this.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, we have to decide what our view of the Bible is.
Yeah.
I view the Bible very differently than what you do. You view the Bible as a textbook, as the absolute
Like a dictation
of exactly what God says and means. And until you can actually at least agree with me on the idea that there are contradictions within the Bible and that it was put together by men, whether it was through divine authority or not, there seems to be a lot of holes and a lot of contradictions. And when you read somebody like Bart Ehrman, you're like, it opens your eyes to the
political motivations, the cultural motivations, the historical setting,
the religious motivations.
Yeah.
Like you learn, the gospel writers had a very, like one, I can't remember which book, but he had a motivation to draw comparison lines from Jesus to David.
Mm-hmm.
So he wrote the story of Jesus with that motivation.
Yeah, Matthew.
And it contradicts the other gospels.
Yeah, even the genealogies.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so when
and yet the people that put the Bible together, they would have known that. They still chose to put them in there. And I think this is important for people to understand when it comes to the Bible. You may have been taught your entire life that it's some kind of dictation. There's technical terms for those belief systems, but the reality is that those views would have been considered, and you can look into this history for yourself. Those views would have been considered idolatrous.
Yeah.
By the early church.
Right.
To view the Bible as some kind of perfect dictation from God just was not something that, especially the thinkers in that day, believed. They didn't believe that.
Yeah. So I think just stepping back to when you transform your idea and understanding of the Bible, I think that's a really, you just don't feel like you have to defend it anymore.
No.
Especially in this age of science and logic and reason, when you're trying to make the argument that the earth is only 6,000 or 5,000 years old, that it's flat because the Bible says it's flat, or some sort of weird translation that like people take that obvious observable things. When I stopped having to defend the Bible as all the things that I had been taught that it was, that was really freeing. As hard as it was, because it was the foundation of my faith. It was the foundation of how I lived my life. I mean, I did not live like Jesus back then. I just didn't. And so,
would you say you live more like the Christ-like version of you?
I try.
Now
I try.
than you did then.
I try my best.
But do you feel like you've grown that way?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. So like I said, and it's cliche and such a Christian thing to say, but I absolutely have fallen in love with Jesus again in a new way. And everything has changed in my paradigm. Like when I was a worship leader at my old church, I very much viewed worship as, all right, time to give God his dues. It's time to,
so that he'll give us his presence.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like he needs our worship. And that's just not how I view worship anymore. It's still an insanely special time to me. And it's even more impactful, in my opinion, because it's like I've reconciled this view of God isn't this deity that requires our worship and requires the peasants to praise him. No. Music is
that's another view that the early church would have looked at as idolatrous.
Sure.
Because of course God doesn't need anything.
No. And I think that's one of the lines that I love is that God doesn't need us, he wants us.
Yes.
And, just that understanding of that redefining of a thing that has been something that I've been doing since I was 15 years old. I've been involved as a worship leader in some sense. And that was the scariest part for me. Because my whole world was wrapped around this.
Mm-hmm.
And losing that part of my identity was terrifying. And something I had built my whole career around too. I wanted to be a worship leader from the minute I started playing guitar on stage. I was like, this is what I was meant to do.
So you even feel like your calling is ripped away from you.
Yeah. Like my purpose in life is gone. And but having a deeper understanding of what that actually is, no. Knowing that God wants you. He loves you. And the way we feel that love and presence is through other people. Yes, I feel that presence when I'm alone. But I tell you what, I feel that presence way more with other people. Mm-hmm. When I'm in a room full of people and you look out, and I'm sorry if I've ever caught eyes with you on stage, from stage, I know it can be awkward. I am looking at people and just seeing the impact that God is having in their life in that moment as they sing those words.
Yeah.
And it's our modern version of creeds. We're all singing these words together, whether we believe them or not. And there's this connection that happens, and there's this emotional experience. This ethereal connection to the divine that happens, and music is almost like that.
It's a magic trick, man.
It's that connecting point, and it was funny because
thing.
Yeah, we were laughing in staff meeting on Monday. Kevin Kaiser was like, "Hey, could you add with everything?" And he's like, "I just sob. There's something about that song, and I think a lot of people have those different types of songs that it's like the barrier for entry in recognition of God's presence it's easier. It almost hyper speeds you into it.
Yeah,
and,
I agree.
And I understand, you come in on a Sunday morning and you may have had a crappy morning. You may, the dog might have crapped on the carpet, or you got a ticket on your way into church. So there's a lot of other things going on in your life. But when you can come into that moment and you just okay, I'm going to let go of everything that's happened. I'm not going to think about what happened before I entered this room. I'm not going to think about what I'm going to do after, but I'm just going to be in this moment. And almost enter this meditative state of contemplation, recognition, of gratitude, of connection, that's how I view worship now. Like it is a at one ment
There you go.
with everyone,
Yeah.
with God, with your community,
Yeah.
with the people that you're playing music with.
With the creation. I mean,
Yeah.
we could go on and
Yeah.
on. God is in all, and all is in God.
And that's something beautiful. Like as far as like an image. In my early days, God was up here and I was down here, and understanding that God is in everything. It's a way cooler version of God that I really, really like.
Oh, yeah. The world just comes to a different kind of level of life or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Well, thanks for being so vulnerable. Is there anything that you would, if you imagine somebody who's, they're in the dumps, man. They're feeling nihilistic. They're angry. They're all that surrounds them is this crumbled wall of beliefs they once had.
Yeah.
They feel dirty in a sense. They're exhausted. Is there something that you feel like you could say that would help them to rebuild something more sustainable?
I always say keep going. You're not done yet. It's just I truly believe that humans need a foundation of their belief. And if your foundation is nihilism, that none of this is for a purpose, and I would at the very least, start with Jesus. Like, go through those ideas and principles.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus was connected to something that was way bigger than him.
Yeah.
His level of understanding is
seeming connectedness or something.
Exactly. It's unreal for us now. Just imagine what it was like back then.
Yeah.
Our level of understanding is so much higher now than it was back then.
Yeah.
And so I would say start there, keep going. You're not done yet. You don't want to live there. I was there. I understand. And I would use the resource of Suncoast as much as you possibly can. You've got you've got Troy, you've got Larry, people that are always willing to sit down and talk and help you through these things. Listen to these podcasts. Listen to people that have gone through it and are further along the journey than you are. And there's this quote, and Kyle's gonna laugh because it's a quote from somebody I probably shouldn't advertise. I don't know who it is, but it's really profound, and I think this not only relates to religion or faith, but in all aspects of life. You can't logic a person out of a thought process they didn't logic themselves into.
Yeah.
If you haven't done the work and spent the time to really get yourself, and it's not just like, oh, I'm going to continue down this rabbit hole of nihilism and atheism and only listen to those people. Yeah, you're going to stay there.
Sure.
Because you haven't logicked your way out of it.
Yeah.
So if you can go to people that...
And you really didn't logic your way into it.
Probably not.
Most likely.
Probably not. But I can't speak to those people. I don't know where they are.
That's true. Fair enough.
But at the end of the day, if it's something that is important to you to get out of that pit, I can guarantee you there's a better way. There is a way that you can reconcile logic and reason with a faith that's resilient and that will lead to a happier and more fulfilling life.
That's good. Thanks, man.
Thank you, man.
Love you.
Love you too.